Suppose we were going to improvise over a 2-5-1 progression in the key of C for simplicity. We might choose the notes of the Dorian mode over the minor 7 chord, the notes of the Mixolydian mode over the dominant chord, and the notes of the Ionian mode over the major 7th chord. We might focus on the chord tones when creating the melody, and maybe play a scale run or part of a scale run somewhere in the midst of those chord changes. If we chose to play the Mixolydian scale over the dominant chord as a scale run, we would notice that the chord tones within the scale fall on the downbeats when the scale is played ascending as eighth notes in 4/4 time, starting on the root of the scale. Since the chord tones within the scale fall in the downbeats, this helps to bring out the sound of the chord more strongly than if the chord tones fell on the upbeats. However, if we continue with this scale for another measure or bar, we will soon realize that the chord tones no longer fall in the downbeats. This is because the Mixolydian scale or mode has 7 notes, while there are places for 8 eighth notes in 4/4 time. So when we continue the scale, the chord tones are no longer in sync with the downbeats. In order to solve this so that we can continue with the scale and still have the chord tones falling on the downbeats, we have to add another note to create an 8-note scale, a chromatic passing note added in the right place to offset the notes of the scale. If we add this extra note between the 7th and 8th note of the scale, this would solve the problem, and in so doing we would have created a bebop scale, or more precisely the dominant bebop scale, since there are various other bebop scales. So to put it simply, the dominant bebop scale, referred to as just the bebop scale, is just a Mixolydian scale with an extra chromatic passing note between the 7th and 8th note of the scale. The same problem happens when you play the Mixolydian scale descending. The chord tones do not fall in the downbeats, but if you add the extra chromatic note, then it works out. This means that we can use the bebop scale either ascending or descending, starting on a chord tone on the downbeat, and the scale will work out well with the chord, since the chord tones within the scale will fall on the downbeats. The dominant bebop scale is usually played descending over dominant chords. It can also be used over minor 7th chords in a 2-5-1 progression. So here you would play the same bebop scale over the dominant and the minor 7th chord preceding it. It can also be used over other chords such as sus4 chords and half diminished chords using the appropriate bebop scale. As stated already, the beauty of this scale is that it allows the chord tones to fall in the downbeats and thus create a smooth and more flowing melody. However, if the scale does not start with the chord tones on the downbeat, then we're back to the same problem as when we started. In this case, we'll have to make some more adjustments to the scale to correct this. This can be done in several ways. The easiest way to do this is just to add another passing note somewhere in the scale to shift the scale so that everything lines up again. This could also be done by lengthening the non-chord tone by an 8th note or by any other method that achieves the same outcome. Before looking at some examples of the bebop scale, let's look at 2 more commonly used types of bebop scales. The major bebop scale has the passing note between the 5th and 6th note of the major scale and is used over any major 7th chord. The scale usually starts on the root, the 3rd, the 5th or the 6th note of the scale on the downbeat so that the other chord tones will land also on the downbeats. The minor bebop scale is used over minor 7th chords and is the same as a dominant bebop scale but has a flattened 3rd. This scale is best used when the minor chord serves as a tonic in a minor 2-5-1 where the progression ends on a minor chord. So if you know your scales, then converting them into bebop scales is just a matter of adding a chromatic passing note in the appropriate place. However, you will find that the bebop players made more use of passing notes to create a flowing melody. There are many books such as How to Play Bebop by David Baker, in which the author gives many examples of how to use the bebop scale and rules how to integrate this scale in chord progressions. Obviously, you will need to listen to the great bebop players like Charlie Parker to get a sense of rhythm and articulation in order to get your playing to sound more like theirs. Now let's look at some simple examples of the bebop scale. One way to use the dominant bebop scale is to play it descending over the 2/5 of a major 2-5-1 progression. Here is an example of this in John Coltrane's Giant Steps. You do not have to use the whole of the scale, instead you could play part of the scale to fill in your melody or as a lead into a dominant chord. Here is a part of the G dominant bebop scale leading into the G7 chord from another chord, not necessarily the 2 chord. If you want to get into playing bebop, as was said, there are many books on the subject containing many exercises that will help you integrate this scale into your playing, but it's probably best to listen to the bebop players and to study their music, especially taking interest in their articulation so that your music does not sound robotic. Well, I hope you found this video interesting and informative as an introduction to the Bebop scale. Don't forget to subscribe if you're not yet a subscriber, and I shall see you soon. Bye-bye.